In the first decade of the 20th century, before the extended triumph of realism in the marketplace of literary criticism, H.G. Wells was considered by many to be the preeminent novelist working in English. His debate with Henry James illuminates the history of how we view the fantastic. In works like The Strange Orchid, Wells touches lightly on the psychosexual drives that social structures of class and gender often repress. In works like The Invisible Man, Wells shows how science offers a fantasy of revenge against such repression. And in works like The Island of Doctor Moreau, the scientist, unrestrained by society, fulfills ancient fairy tale fantasies while simultaneously adulterating all that is natural. In what Wells called his scientific romances, the fantastic highlights the eternal tension between society's need for stability and the disruptive desires of individuals. Herbert George Wells wrote superb fiction and nonfiction. At the turn of the 20th century, he and James were considered the two foremost living writers of English prose. James publicly asserted in a debate that they carried on in print that the novel must explore individual psychology, as, for example, in his famous work, The Portrait of a Lady. In that novel, the protagonist walks into a room and sees the man she thinks of as someone who is her lover sitting while an other woman stands. In the flash of a moment, she understands that there must have been a prior relationship between these two, or even a continuing one, for him to be so relaxed, seated in the presence of a standing woman. That little detail, that little nuance, that inference from the smallest little interaction between individuals brings the entire emotional structure of the novel crashing down on the protagonist. It's that psychological exploration, that realism of response, that James argued the novel was for. But Wells asserted that the novel needs to explore the great social forces that shape all of us, regardless of our individual differences. For example, in The Food of the Gods, one of his late great scientific romances, a group of scientists managed to artificially produce a food that greatly increases the size and the intelligence of people. They are becoming like supermen, and they want to share this with everyone. In fact, what happens is the little people, meaning all ordinary folk like us, begin to resent the fact that these big folk think that the world is better and that they can tell us how we should behave, and they go to war against them. The big folk, wanting to bring the little folk along, begin to lob shells full of this food into the cities where the little folk live. And the little folk sue the big folk in the international courts of law under the Geneva Conventions, claiming that the food of the gods is poison, and poison gas is prohibited under the Geneva Convention. In other words, what Wells is trying to show us is that even the most obvious technological improvement, when we see how it works its way through social structures, may turn out to be good or bad, positive or disruptive, depending upon the ways in which people understand these inventions to function in their own world. The pursuit of pattern is something that Wells did for his entire writing career. In order to earn his way through college, at one point for 2 years he was the lab assistant to T.H. Huxley, Darwin's great disciple and popularizer. And Wells was probably the very first writer who truly understood evolution and the theory of patterns of forces shaping the world. He wrote single-handedly The Outline of History, being a plain history of life and mankind, published in 4 hardback volumes in 1920, in the days when a hardback volume cost about a day's worth of labor for an average working man. That series sold 250,000 copies in its first American printing alone. The Outline of History was an attempt to see how all of human history, particularly that driven by geography, technology, climate, and so on, was an evolution, as opposed to the traditional way of looking at history as the stories of the deeds of great men and rulers and conflicts and wars. In his fiction, Wells analyzes the modern world, but in his early great scientific romances, he does this built on a foundation of fairy tales. For example, in the Plattner story, he has a man discover some green powder in his laboratory. It blows up, and suddenly he finds himself at the top of a ramp, looking down into a world covered by a green miasma, in which folks are wandering back and forth in some stately interchange. He walks down into the miasma, he joins them, and as he goes toward them, he passes through them. It turns out that he wanders trying to find out what's going on, unsuccessfully, for about 9 days. That's a pregnant number that Wells has chosen. When he returns, he walks up the ramp and is discovered by his headmaster. He's a chemistry teacher at a high school, lying on his floor, and he explains that he didn't know what was going on there, but he felt that there were these watchers, perhaps even the souls of his parents, who were keeping concern over him as he wandered. No time has passed at the school, and so his story is completely disbelieved until, on physical examination, it's discovered that his internal organs have been reversed. What to make of the Plattner story? Is it in fact a visceral reversal of our lives to come to believe that we can be back in the presence of our departed loved ones? Is this a critique of religion? The Strange Orchid is a fascinating story about a man who lives a completely pedestrian Victorian life. He owns a home, and he has installed in his home his distant female cousin as an act of charity to serve as his housekeeper. He has independent means and spends his time reading, and in particular in the greenhouse he has in his garden, growing orchids. He gathers orchids from around the world, but never, of course, goes around the world himself. He orders them from orchid collectors. He has come upon one orchid which brings with it the extraordinary story that it was found on the body of an orchid gatherer in the Amazon. The bulb was collected, put in a glass jar, and is now sold. He takes the bulb and he plants it in his greenhouse. To make this story even shorter, he goes out one day to look at this wonderful flowering, developing orchid and is overcome by the scent of this lush purple blossom. It has filled the entire greenhouse, and he swoons, that's the word, swoons, and falls down on the ground. The next thing he knows, his eyes are opened, there is a cold wind blowing on him. His cousin, his asexual housekeeper, has come down, seen what was going on, gone into the greenhouse, and discovered that the orchid had its tendrils no longer flying around in the air, these aerial tendrils, but they had descended onto his cheek, face, and hands, and there was a little trickle of blood coming off his cheek. So she broke the glass of the greenhouse. The Victorian northern English air came in, and the orchid shriveled to a black putrescence, a lot like the putrescence at the end of Poe's The Facts in the Case of Monsieur Valdemar. What we have here is clearly at a repressed level a sexual competition between the vampire orchid and the Victorian housekeeper. They were both vying for the economic support of the Victorian gentleman. What do you think he thinks of this? In fact, what he thinks is this. In the last lines of the story, the next morning, the orchid still lay there, black now and putrescent. The door banged intermittently of the greenhouse in the morning breeze, and all the array of Wedderburn's orchids was shriveled and prostrate. But Wedderburn himself was bright and garrulous upstairs in the glory of his strange adventure. This is an adventure, of course, that he did not take himself, but was only infected by. The story, in other words, suggests the protagonist represents Victorian middle class. The living situation suggests repressed sexuality. The setting itself, with the attachment of the greenhouse to keep these exotics alive, suggests a modern need for romance. And the description suggests a kind of erotic vegetation myth, much like that of Rapunzel. The plot suggests a critique of Victorian fantasies, and yet at the same time a ratification of them, because we need to be more than just living on our investments. The Invisible Man has created an image that goes throughout all of modern literature. We all know about this man who can just go around the world completely unseen. In Wells's story, Griffin, his name after all, is that of a mythical beast. Griffin, the title character, is a chemist. He fools with things and finds a way to make himself invisible. What happens, of course, is that his invisibility works only if he's unclothed, and so he needs to go naked in the world. Going naked in the world, he is cold, like the orchid in the previous story. And what can you do with invisibility besides indulge your own prurience? Well, it turns out that you can steal and you can murder. At least that's what Griffin thinks of to do. He is, in effect, someone who wants to turn against society. He doesn't, for instance, think he can use his invisibility in the service of the intelligence corps to keep His Majesty's, or in this period, Her Majesty's, government safe. He is a man of great personal bitterness. The novel reflects and critiques Victorian attitudes. Again, we have repressed sexuality. Again, we have reference to other things that are not explicit. For instance, in order to extend his dominion over an English county, he wants to enlist the help of an ordinary Englishman, and he finds a dissolute who can be convinced to serve him by being punched by an invisible hand until he is sure that indeed he's in the hands of an angry God. The man's name is Thomas Marvel. Like Doubting Thomas, he won't have faith in Griffin until he can feel him, but unlike Jesus, who says to Thomas, "Put your hands inside my wound," this deity, or would-be deity, punches the Thomas, and his name is Marvel, because he needs to see marvels in order to function. Griffin desires to be a god. His aim is imperialistic, just like England's. But at the end, in fact, he fails. Of course he could murder anyone, but he'd have to live naked and alone. The people realize that they are being marauded, and eventually, when it's recognized that he is in a public place, a pub, they surround him. They can't see him, but they can feel him as he tries to break out of their circle. When they surround him, they punch him, and eventually they beat him to death. As he dies, he becomes visible again in a marvelous description, first of his bones, then of his inner organs and circulatory system, and finally of his skin. And it is at that moment that the crowd around him goes, "Oh, horrible, horrible." And we're told that 3 little children who tried to push through the crowd were turned away by their parents to keep from seeing. Because Griffin is an albino. Griffin, we have learned already from one of the characters earlier in the novel, was always shunned by his fellows at university because he was physically different. It's not simply that he has aboriginal viciousness and bitterness the way some of Poe's characters do. He has been rejected by society, and then, having been rejected, he attacks society in turn. And yet, society does have to defend itself against the aberrant individual who would claim so much power as to be able to change it. The ending lets us know that there is a critique here, and this critique is one that is intended to balance quite carefully the relationship between the individual and society. We can understand that quite well, I think, by comparing the use of invisibility in The Invisible Man with the use of invisibility in the Plattner story. You see, in The Invisible Man, Griffin would not have been caught by the villagers, would not need to worry about the cold, if Wells had simply decided that in Griffin's case, invisibility goes along with insubstantiality. If, as in the Plattner story, Griffin could walk through people, they never could have killed him. And clearly Wells was capable of creating an invisibility that allowed insubstantiality because he did it in the Plattner story. In other words, we can infer that Griffin's invisibility is a conscious rhetorical device created specifically to show us that even when we think we are invisible to society, and even when we think that we can behave regardless of the desires of society, we must in fact recognize that we can only thrive by making some accommodation with society. But that is not to say that society needs to dominate the individual, because the fundamental problem, conflict in this novel, arises because first society was not able to see past the visible to the brilliant man within. Parables like this, taking fairy tale ideas, I'll be invisible, putting them in a scientific context, have made Wells one of the great writers of all times. Another of his works that gives us an image that comes down throughout modern literature and our culture is that from the Island of Doctor Moreau, the making of beasts into people. Now, we all know that because we've heard of the story of the Island of Doctor Moreau, but when the story was first published, of course, people had not yet heard of the story, and as we read the story, we find that there are no beast people initially. In fact, the first of the beast people we see, someone named Mling, is not described as a beast person at all, but rather metaphorically. His eyes have a certain kind of animal fire. He turns with an animal swiftness, the narrator says. Only later do we find out that Mling had begun as an animal and that Moreau had manipulated him surgically and chemically to make him into something that passes for a rather coarse, but nonetheless real human being. This is a novel about a series of monstrous experiments. These experiments critique science because we see that science can be misused. It brings great unhappiness on the animals who are changed by it. There is something natural about an animal, even a predatory animal, and to stop them from being their natural selves is to impose on them. But this is also a critique of European colonialism, because Moreau has taken over an island and he has populated it with these beast people of his own creation, and he seeks to rule over them as if they were a god. Now, in fact, this is what the English did. I'm going to read to you from the birthday speech, that is the Queen's birthday, in 1838, given by the governor of Australia to a collection of aboriginals. Black men, we wish to make you happy, but you cannot be happy unless you imitate good white men. Build huts, wear clothes, work and be useful. Above all, you cannot be happy unless you love God, who made heaven and earth and man and all things. Love white men. Love other tribes of black men. Do not quarrel together. Tell other tribes to love white men and to build good huts and wear clothes, learn to speak English. If any man injure you, tell the protector, and he will do you justice. Quite famously, in the Island of Doctor Moreau, Moreau has created what he calls the law, and the beast people are told to chant this, and they do it as if it were a religious litany that they must go through again and again. Not to go on all fours, that is the law. Are we not men? Not to suck up drink, that is the law. Are we not men? Not to eat flesh nor fish, that is the law. Are we not men? Not to chase other men, that is the law. Are we not men? This is an amalgamation of the Queen's birthday speech and the rhetoric of religion. The answers to all of these questions are no. You are not men, and even if you were, men eat meat and fish and fight with each other and suck up water if that's the only way they can get a drink. This is a critique of colonialism, as well as a critique of misuse of science. But it's also more subtle, because the story is told by Prendick, a man who strategically leaves things out. And it's told of a Dr. Moreau, a man who strategically leaves things out. The story begins with an introduction by Prendick's nephew. On February the 1st, 1887, the Lady Vane was lost by collision with a derelict when about the latitude 1 degree south and longitude 107 degrees west. On January the 5th, 1888, that is 11 months and 4 days later, my uncle Edward Prendick, a private gentleman who certainly went aboard the Lady Vane in Callao and who had been considered drowned, was picked up at latitude, etc., etc., etc. The language is the language of science. There's no emotion here, and yet his uncle is a private gentleman. Like Wedderburn in the Strange Orchid, he lives on someone else's labor. He owns, and that's all he need do. He goes to the Island of Doctor Moreau, and on the Island of Doctor Moreau, he comes under the sway of the doctor. Language on this island is crucial. Moreau and Prendick both use it as a colonial tool. The way that Prendick gets to the island is disembarking with M'Ling, as M'Ling is bringing cages of new animals in, it turns out, to be experimented upon. However, there's no way to get off the island, and Prendick becomes an unwilling at first and then quite willing guest of Moreau. He asks Moreau about his prior experiments, and he says, well, he was trying to create in the image of man. Well, of course, God created man in his image. Moreau is the God. Did you always create men? Ah, well, once I had a snake and I tried but failed with that. And we realized that this is a fallen world, not a paradise at all. And then there was another time when I tried to model it not on a man, but, ah, yes. And then he breaks his concentration and changes the subject. In other words, Moreau, unwilling to say it, had tried to create a woman for himself, but had decided that it didn't quite work out. They're unwilling to speak of themselves. And we need to read more closely. In the very first chapter of Prendick's narration, the manuscript that his nephew has put before us, he talks about how he was originally picked up by this vessel that's making a special trip to Moreau's Island after the vessel on which he was had been destroyed in collision. As you heard, he and 2 sailors were shipwrecked on a particular lifeboat. They were under the sun. It became pitiless. The water ended, that is the fresh water they had with them, on the 4th day, and we were already thinking strange things and saying them with our eyes, but it was, I think, the 6th before Helmer gave voice to the thing we all had in mind. I remember our voices dry and thin, so that we bent towards one another and spared our words. I stood out against it with all my might, was rather for scuttling the boat and perishing together among the sharks that followed us. But when Helmer said that, if his proposal was accepted, we should have a drink, the sailor came round to him. Now, we're not told what this thing that he won't say is, but we know what it is. It's cannibalism. They're going to kill one of them by lot and drink his blood to survive. But our narrator says, without ever saying what it is, that he won't participate. Now, the lot falls to the sailor, but the sailor decides that he won't accept being slaughtered for the sake of the other two, or so Prendick says. And he and Helmer grapple with each other, and then we're told they fell upon the gunwale and rolled overboard together. They sank like stones. And that's the last we hear of them, but fortunately enough, Prendick manages to get to the island, or get picked up by another boat. Or does he? Maybe, in fact, he's the last survivor of cannibalism. Why should we believe him? We know, for example, that he actually lies. We know that he lies because he himself tells us that after Moreau is killed, that he goes to the beast people and says, Moreau is still watching us from above. He can still inflict pain upon you from above. You still must follow the law. He turns Moreau into a god so that he can use God as a religious institution that will, in fact, control the beast people for his own safety. And that's why the law says, do not eat flesh or fish, are we not men? Because Moreau realizes that these beasts, leopards, for example, and bears and hyenas, who could easily kill him, would if they were not convinced to behave differently. These characters say more about themselves than they intend. Language here is the mark of being human. And that is indeed as it should be. Because, as it says, an animal may be ferocious and cunning enough, but it takes a real man to tell a lie. And that's what Prendick and Moreau do all the time. We need to come to understand them better. Here, I think, is one of the great lies and beautiful pieces of writing in the book. Moreau is dead. Montgomery has scuttled the boats so that Prendick cannot leave the island. A sudden convulsion of rage shook me. I was almost moved to batter his foolish head in as he lay there helpless at my feet. He's been wounded, Montgomery has. Then suddenly his hand moved so feebly, so pitifully, that my wrath vanished. He groaned and opened his eyes for a minute. I knelt beside him and raised his head. He opened his eyes again, staring silently at the dawn, and then they met mine. The lids fell. Sorry, he said presently with an effort. He seemed trying to think. The last, he said, the last of this silly universe. What a mess. I listened. His head fell helplessly to one side. Now, you notice, of course, Prendick had been holding this head. Prendick probably is from the Latin prendere, to hold. If his head fell helplessly to one side, it's because Prendick let it go, but he doesn't say that. I thought some drink might revive him, but there was neither drink nor vessel in which to bring drink at hand. Notice the word hand coming up yet again. He seemed suddenly heavier. My heart went cold. I bent down to his face, put my hand through the rent in his blouse. He was dead. I don't know about you, but when I'm in a strange place and there's a faucet running and I want to drink and there's no vessel at hand, I use my hand to drink. There was something at hand to help Montgomery, but Prendick wouldn't do it. I think, in fact, Prendick killed Montgomery and just doesn't want to say it. What we see in the Beast People is the confusion of what is truly beastly and what is truly human. Is a dumb creature, in fact, stupider than we, or only silent and expressing his nature? Prendick first sees Mling as a man, but then he comes to realize that Mling is a primate that has been modified into a man. This accords perfectly with Freud's idea of what creates the fantastic in the uncanny. We see the familiar, in an unfamiliar place. We take a metaphor and we make it literal. He cast his eye about the room. Prendick's misunderstanding shows a culpable European centrism. When the novel ends, Prendick has been changed. He can no longer stand the company of humans, just as Gulliver could not after having been with the utopian Winhams at the end of Gulliver's Travels. Earlier, we see a march of people from the House of Pain to the House of the Beast People. And the line says this: Moreau, Montgomery, myself, and Maling went across the island. Moreau, the god; Montgomery, the protector of the hill, his viceroy; myself, Prendick, and Maling. Suddenly we know that Maling is a manling. He is the transitional character between the animal and the human. Maling is associated always with the beach, the place where the boats were burned, the place where they disembarked. The beach is always in literature, when it's a crucial setting, the zone of conflict between elementally contending forces. In the Island of Doctor Moreau, those forces are civilization and true empathetic civilization. The question Wells here and often leaves us with is this: shall we go toward the colonial or toward the respectful? Toward the egotistical or toward the social? Toward the isolated or toward the integrated? It is no surprise that it is he who is the first writer to popularize the use of the word ecology. No progress can be made without the imagination of humans, but all humans must recognize that they too are subject to great forces beyond them, that indeed we are all talking animals.